الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله ذي الملك والملكوت ذي العزة والجبروت. الحمد لله حي قيوم لا ينام، عزيز لا يضام، قهار لا يرام. وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. O you believe, fear Allah as He should be feared, and die not except on the state of Islam. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the most merciful, grant us this great gift to die on the state of Islam. Allahumma ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Amma ba'd, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the beginning of Surah Al-Rum, لله الأمر من قبل ومن بعد ويومئذ يفرح المؤمنون. All the matters before and after belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that day the believers will be rejoicing. Rejoicing with what? With Nasrullahi, the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, help, support and give victory to whom He will, and He is Al-Aziz Al-Rahim, the Almighty, the especially merciful subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this ayah mentioning that all the matters belong to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the rejoicing of the believer of the help and the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a matter of belief, because when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestow upon His faithful believers victory by removing away from them the transgression, the injustice, it is really a great felicity for the believer to witness such a thing, and it has a lot of lessons that we would like to explore, some of them to help us into our society today. But subhanAllah, what we have, many of you already have witnessed, in this past week, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala removing the transgression on our people in Syria. For may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to empower them and unite them, and to strengthen their society, and to help them that will attain, insha'Allah, united society under the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to give victory to our people in Gaza and Palestine. Allahumma ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Witnessing such a day, it is a felicity for the believers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it when He started the ayat, Alif Lam Mim, Ghulibat al-Rum, the Romans, they have been defeated by the Persian. And He said in few years in the nearest land they're going to be defeating the Persians. And subhanAllah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned this to have the believer always, even though when this ayat has been revealed, they were revealed in Mecca, they were like vulnerable, they were like, when I say vulnerable, they were not in a state even to fight. They were like, very weak, they were few in numbers, and they were like building the faith, and the Prophet ﷺ has just few people following him at the time. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala given the advance to the believer that they have to look at this cause that they are standing for, the belief they adhere to, is something a concern. It's not of a tribe or like a town or a city, but is a concern of the whole universe. As a matter of fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the ayat that follows, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inviting the believer and the whole humankind to reflect on the creation of the heaven and the earth, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't create such a thing for vain or without a purpose, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created for a purpose, and He created for the truth. Therefore, whatever happened in this universe is in the matter of the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For the believer to have that security, to believer to have that firmness, to believer to have that yaqeen, the certainty in their heart that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will fulfill His promise that He has promised. The fulfillment of the promise of establishing justice, fulfilling of the promise of eradicating all the tyrants, and is going to happen by the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala whenever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will. For the believer, when he sees such a thing, first Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala قَالَ يَوْمَئِذٍ يَفْرَحُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, because the believers, they live such, struggle, I will say struggle standing just to stand for the truth, just for wishing and working and contributing for the justice to be established. It is a concern into the heart of the believer. The people who do also, subhanAllah, only indulge themselves into the pleasure of this worldly life, they don't think about such a thing. They think just for their own things, how they make money, how they, fulfill or like indulge into their pleasure, but they don't think is this great virtue. Such a virtue will bring balance to the whole humanity. Such a virtue would bring joy and happiness to the whole society. There, the believer, when such a thing happen, every believer on the planet Earth, even though they are very far from that land, but they rejoice it. Why they rejoice it? Because it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made in the heart of the believer to interact with it, to rejoice, to see, subhanAllah, that happiness into your heart because of such a thing. Is, subhanAllah, for a long period, the injustice, the transgression, the dhulm, the oppression is, subhanAllah, dominating this land or dominating people. When you see some of the people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lift on them such a thing with the striving of the believer, it is the day that the believer need to rejoice. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the rejoicing of the believer, the days of celebration of the believer is all related to their iman, to their faith, to their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make for us two Eid, and both Eid are related to the faith, both Eid connect us with Allah, both Eid we are celebrating the nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the celebration of the oneness of Allah, the celebration of increasing of piety, and then everything that connects you with Allah, everything that you see in it, aspect of Allah's pleasure, aspect of the manifestation of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, need to make us happy, need to have us to be rejoicing, and that's the way of the believer. Many, subhanAllah, this day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala called them Ayyamullah, Ayyamullah, in which the manifestation of the mercy of Allah, the help of Allah, the empowerment, the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to empower and to help the believer to come at a level where they feel like freedom, when they feel like able to establish the unity into their society and establish the justice. Such a great feeling that no one, subhanAllah, can really taste it except the true believer. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said from the aspect obvious and evidence and imminent for such great days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like the day of helping the believers, as we have witnessed it, all of us, as an example. Help, subhanallah, قال Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah said in Surah At-Tawbah, قال قاتلوهم يعذبهم الله بأيديكم قال ويخزهم وينصركم عليهم ويشفي صدور قوم مؤمنين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ordaining the believers to go fight the people who transgress them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said He will punish them by your hand and He will disgrace them. But the most important here then is aspect, قَالَ وَيَشْفِي, He'll be soothing the hearts of the believer. He's going to expand their breasts. He's going to healing that, subhanAllah, grudge, that sadness into their hearts is going to be taken away. قَالَ وَيُذْهِبْ غَيْظَ قلوبهم, and He will remove that rage from their heart. So imagine, subhanAllah, being under oppression and being under such situation, make a person to be suffocated, anxious, worry, in grief, all of that by the day of a victory, by a day that granted to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, take away all of that. قال ويتوب الله على من يشاء. Allah pardon whom He will, because anyone who wants to be repentant, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will accept him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is for us as a believer. When we witness such a thing, we need really to reflect and invite ourselves. What can we learn and what can we reap from such a day that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestow on the believers? And the believers not only in that land, but believer everywhere, because wallahi we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is fulfilling His promise for our people of Gaza. So therefore, the patience is what is the key, as I'm going to explain it further, the key of the success, the key of the soothing of the heart. Why? Because the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a promise that will never fail. When this ayah was revealed, قال ألف لام ميم غلبت الروم في أدنى الأرض ومن بعد غلبهم سيغلبون في بضع سنين. And after they defeat, they're going to be triumphing. Allah give them the triumph over the Persian, and this is going to be in a few years. Bid'a sinin, from 3 to 10 years. The disbeliever, they were like kind of, mocking, and they saying to Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala, and he said, oh, again, your companion, he's, claiming such, weird things. They talking about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. قال Abu Bakr قال ما قال إلا صدقا. He said, what he said is the truth, is certain. They told him, will you make a bet? He said, yes, I will. And he make a bet with them. So the Prophet ﷺ قال ما حملك على ذلك. Why did you do that? Why make the bet? And the bet at the time, it's still, there is no Sharia in it, because afterward the Sharia and the ruling to prohibit it came afterward. But he make a bet, so he said, out of the belief in Allah and His messengers, تصديقا لله ورسوله. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قال وَمِن بَعْدِ غَلَبِهِمْ سَيَغْلِبُونَ, and they're going to be defeating the Persian afterward in a few years. Is going to happen with no doubt. And this is all what we need into our hearts, is that certainty in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because when you see it with your own eyes, such a thing happening, a believer will be like taking, a time to reflect. He said, "Did this make me to be happy or not?" Because if it didn't have me to be rejoicing, I might be one who really totally heedless, or maybe not aware of things happening. But I'll land, an attentive ear. What happened? When I realized, and I didn't know the history, how subhanAllah, they been under tyranny, under oppression, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala helped them, to give them this victory, then it need to rejoice me. Why? Because when you see such a thing, this is the fulfillment of the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which should, give us more firmness into our heart, empower our confidence in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and help us to be nearer to Allah, and help us also to be enjoying, insha'Allah, and making istibshar. Istibshar is like we're going to be waiting for the glad tidings of the liberation of the people of Palestine. This is a need to be in the heart of the believer. It might not be in your lifetime, but you know that is going to happen, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us that such a promise, if it's not fulfilled into your life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it's going to be fulfilled anyway. It's going to be fulfilled because this earth will be inherited. It will be in the hand of the pious people who are going to establish justice all over. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, do not think that Allah is unaware of what the transgressor and oppressor are doing. قَالَ إِنَّمَا يُؤَخِّرُهُمْ, He's delaying them. To what? To our life, to see them being defeated. No, قَالَ لِيَوْمٍ تَشْخَصُ فِيهَا الْأَبْصَارُ. When it comes in that day, when people, subhanAllah, they will be like open eyes, they cannot even close it, and they are disgraced. That the time, it is the day of resurrection. Therefore, the belief in our in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must be certain, must be. So it have that knowledge of certainty. Now that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have us to witness in our life, and this is what happened last week, to witness such a thing, it need to move you up into the iman. It need to move you from the certainty that you have it with knowledge, with belief, with the certainty that you see it with your own eyes, what you call ta'ayinul yaqeen. So you seeing it with your own eyes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestowed His favor subhanahu wa ta'ala upon the believer to give them such a thing. Therefore, when we think of the wa'd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we think of the promise of Allah in a certain way, in a certainty, which means it's going to happen with no doubt. If it didn't happen in your lifetime, you said this is, out of the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and He had the matter, as He said, subhanahu wa ta'ala, all the matter in His hand before the victory of the Persian and after the victory of the Romans. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He gave like a hint for the believer, that also you, the rejoicing of the day of the believer with the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Some of the scholars, they saying that was in the time of Badr, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the believer to overcome the polytheists in Badr. But also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala victory granted to the believer after the Prophet ﷺ has passed away in the year 12th of the Hijrah, and in the year 50th of the Hijrah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had them to overcome both the Persian and the Romans. In 16 months, Khalid ibn al-Walid defeated the biggest empire of that time. Why? Because of the truthful hearts. And this is, subhanAllah, what makes the believer. Now, when you believe in the promise of Allah in a certain way, I meant by certainty, in yaqeen, this is need to be manifested, to be reflected in our life, be reflected in our behavior, be reflected in our conduct. This is the most important. That's why we mainly talking about it today. So when you have a certainty in believing in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to happen, this is what is going to bring you that comfort into your heart. This is going to make, subhanAllah, that have you to be always in that type of the soothing mercy, really embracing it and being into this soothing mercy, because you are close to Allah and you know it's going to happen, subhanAllah. You know it's going to happen. So the believers, he have his certainty in the promise of Allah to really make or define their way of life. Define their way of life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this is not restricted when it comes to oppression and tyrant. No, it extends to every aspect in your life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promise you rizq, then be comforted. So this nasr that we have seen is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fulfilling His promise to the believers. He will fulfill His promise to you. You make dua, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, just be patient, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give it to you. In fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said right after the ayah that we have mentioned, قَالَ وَعْدَ اللَّهِ is the promise of Allah. لَا يُخْلِفُ اللَّهُ وَعْدَ. Allah never failed His promise. He promised you to make you live a good life. He will, subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it is your steps toward Him that you are failing, not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promise. That's how the believer, we need to look at the aspect to know, the problem with ourselves, within ourselves, to help ourselves, because Allah, whatever He promised you, it is the promise of the truth. And subhanAllah, when Allah fulfill for you the promise, such have a felicity, such a thing has such a beauty in the heart, such a taste of sweetness that no one can, subhanAllah, describe it for you. And this is another gift. Look, the people in paradise, one of their great bliss, they will be, feeling and subhanAllah observing, and they have it like such, a great felicity in their life. Not just to be in the Jannah, but to feel that Allah fulfilled their promise. So the fulfilling of the promise, it has itself a bliss inside. It has such, happiness, such a joy that no one can describe. وَقَالُوا الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ الَّذِي صَدَقَنَا وَعْدَهُ. And they said, Alhamdulillah, that He has fulfilled to us His promise. So the fulfilling of the promise itself, it's a great favor from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As a matter of fact, if you reflect on the people of the cave, they have been, subhanAllah, sleeping for 309 years. And Allah resurrected them for two conditions, for two reasons. They've been resurrected, they had died, but subhanAllah, they've been resurrected for people to see them, to become, subhanAllah, a miracle for them. So for the people of the cave to realize that they have lived, slept for 309 years. قَالَ وَكَذَلِكَ أَعْثَمْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ لِيَعْلَمُوا أَنَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهِ حَقٌّ. To know that the promise of Allah is the promise of the truth. Can you imagine how much they've been rejoicing, the people of the cave and the people who found them? Both. And after that they died. Why they didn't live long? For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give them that bliss, to give them that joy. وَأَنَّ السَّاعَةَ, and the Sa'ah is coming with no doubt, which they're going to be, paradise is waiting for them. What should they live actually? Because they're going to be like fully stranger people. Everyone is younger than them, more than 300 years. So the rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take them. But after giving them this joy into their heart, that the promise of Allah is the promise of the truth. So subhanAllah, look, the higher you get into the faith, the higher you will be having more bliss, more subhanAllah, that sweetness of the iman that you cannot describe. It's such a joy that no one can get with the pleasure of the dunya. It's impossible, because the pleasure of the dunya is a fleeting moment. You have it now and then it goes away, and people, they try to get it back. That's how they get into addiction. But the pleasure when you are near to Allah subhanAllah is sustained and is going up and up and up. And this is with the knowledge. you have the knowledge of the certainty. Now that you saw it with your own eyes becomes Aynul Yaqeen. So it increases up. Look, Ibrahim alayhi salam, he requested, he inquired and beseeched Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to show him how he will bring death to life. Why? Because he wants that boost of certainty in his heart. He wants more nearness to Allah. He wants more comfort in his heart, more soothing into his heart from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second great element when you witness such the days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it to be a way to be a reminder, reminding ourselves with it and remind people with it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the message of Musa alayhi salam, قال وَلَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا مُوسَى إِلَى بِآيَاتِنَا أَنْ أَخْرِجْ قَوْمَكَ مِنَ الظُّلُمَاتِ إِلَى النُّورِ. We have sent Musa with our verses, with our signs, with our message to take out your people from the darkness into the light. قال وَذَكِّرْهُمْ بِأَيَّامِ اللَّهِ, and remind them of the days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the days of victory, the days like Musa alayhi salam, he was fasting after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him from Fir'aun and he made them to drown. That's one of the great day of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So witness such a day of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it need to be a reminder for us. Is a time that you have to reflect and really kind of hold yourself accountable about the state of your faith. Because you need to rejoice such a thing. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala amazingly, He said, إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَاتٍ لِكُلِّ صَبَّارٍ شَكُورٍ. In these are signs for people who are patient, steadfast, perseverant, وَشَكُور, grateful. Which is bring us to the second point important, which is one of the great impact of and blessing that we reap from witnessing such days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to understand that patience is the key of success. Why? Because in this ayah Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, in these signs of people who are patient, when you are patient, subhanAllah, you are always firm, steadfast. But when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bestow upon you the favor, then you're going to be so grateful to Allah. So the intensity of gratefulness, of your gratefulness to Allah, depends on how sincere you were into your patience. And the more sincere you are in patience and devotion to Allah, the better you'll be grateful to Allah. Then Allah will complete for you the gift of the servitude to Him by making the balance between high patience in time of difficulty and being grateful in the time of ease. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when making such a thing, to help us understand how great the sabr is. Now, when you're talking about patience and endurance, we have to understand what is the reality, what is the truth of the patience that can be for you the key for success. This patience is not to be passive. This patience is not to wait, crossing your hand and then you thinking when it's going to happen. No, the patience is totally different thing. And this is when you see such fulfillment of the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you need to activate this great key for your success, which is patience. This patience, dear brother, respected sister, it's like, subhanAllah, planting within yourself an energy, within a framework of being, subhanAllah, of difficulty, a situation that you are, you've been, subhanAllah, struck by difficulty or by calamity, or you've been in a situation that you are controlled, you cannot do anything, mustadaf, which is mean like you are weak. But subhanAllah, being in a society when your voice is not heard, when subhanAllah in a situation that everybody is indulging into the pleasure of the dunya, they cannot even listen to you, then you're going to have like subhanAllah this energy inside you within this situation that we live, because we're not going to say, wallahi, what we can do, everybody is doing the same thing, we do not have the choice. No, you have the choice. Actually, we do not have the choice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us in Surah An-Nisa, those Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be taking their soul in a state of wickedness. They said, كُنَّ مُسْتَضْعَفِينَ فِي الْأَرْضِ. We were weak in the land, we didn't have anything to say. So Allah, the angel, they said, had it not been the earth of Allah so vast that you can migrate to it, but you like it to be here. Why? Because this is a dream, this is enjoying, this is all the toys that you have. No such a thing for the believer, the true believer. So when we thinking about the sabr is that energy that you build within yourself to help you be enthusiastic, to really put all your effort to reach the ihsan. And the ihsan here is a comprehensive term, which is, for us denote everything high that you want to get to it. High in iman, in faith, high in akhlaq, in morality, high in bina, in building, high in striving, all that is called ihsan. Therefore, the sabr becomes like kind of a fortress, a secure fortress, in which you work so hard to build your identity, to build a personality that it has dignified, perseverance, and has the capacity of perseverance and striving. That is the sabr. That is the sabr. So the patience is to build for yourself a secure fortress, to make it the foundation of a strong personality, of a robust, really personality. Its foundation is the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Its objective is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guidelines and directive and message. And it is the way how it stands, how it sustained itself by striving in the sake of Allah. That is the patience that we're talking about. For this reason, look, and this fortress will help you, depends on the context. The context of people who are facing, such calamities like our people of Gaza, that patience is like a fortress for them, to give them more strength to see the element of victory are coming together for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to fulfill it for them whenever He will subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see it for our people in the land of the Sham, it is that fortress who's going to help them to really endure all this fitan now, to bring each other together, to unite and to build the society, establishing justice, inshallah, under the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For us, the same. Because it is the fortress we are in a dunya, subhanallah, secular, godless society. Immorality is something that is shunned, that is taken away from the whole society. So the believer, he going to make the sabr. It is that fortress secure in which he going to build this true identity of his, of being a believer, near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, rejoicing the fact that he is always close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, the fulfillment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promise for us is not limited or restricted to, to dealing with tyrants, with the society, not for every, as I have said, every aspect of our life. Look, Yaqub alayhi salam is a great example for us. Yaqub, to teach us his certainty in believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. His certainty, he said to his children, قال إن الحكم لله. The hukm, the judgment belongs only to Allah. عليه توكلت. On Him I put my reliance subhanahu wa ta'ala. وعليه فليتوكل المتوكلون. Then afterward, after long years, he didn't see his son. After long years, maybe he thinks that he died. No. He has a certainty that he's going to see his son. Why? Because he has it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah promised him. How He promised him? He promised him, Allah, from the dream. It's only a dream of Yusuf that he told him. Then he told him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to make for you something great. He's going to have you to get, inherit the legacy of the people of Yaqub, of the family of Yaqub. After years, he didn't. We are human, we are weak. He was grieving, and he said, when they were blaming him on the grief, he said, hold on, I'm just complaining my grief to Allah, to none of you. Then when he sent to his children, he said, قالت حسن, just look for Yusuf and his brother. We know where his brother is, but Yusuf, we're talking about Yusuf. It's now almost 30 years he didn't tell him, and you mentioned his name first. Look how he answered them with a strong, certain heart. He said, لا تيأسوا, do not despair from the hope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Indeed, if you do so, you are kuffar. Only people give up in the hope of Allah, give up in the soothing mercy of Allah, only the people who are loser, only the people who do not believe. Therefore, do not despair ever, you, all of us. Allah told you, I'll give you rizq. Do not despair. Do not give up. Allah, people are battling, anxiety and things. If you truly believe in Allah, Allah promised you a joyful life. Just hold fast. Wallahi, Allah will get you to the peaceful shore. But you have to have the certainty first into your heart. And then when the glad tidings came to him, he didn't say, oh my son, I didn't see him for a long time. He said something to make his point, to teach his children and to teach us. He said, have I not told you that I know from Allah that you do not know? That Allah, what He said is certain. Then when they realized what they said, oh Father, ask for us forgiveness. فنسأل الله أن يغفر لنا أجمعين. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله وكفى والصلاة والسلام على النبي المصطفى أما بعد. True believers take advantage of all the grants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one of these grants is to witness one of the days of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah removing oppression from believers and give them this opportunity to build, their society is a great day of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we need to reap from it a lot of lesson that it will be pouring on our personality and our conduct by improving it with the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, when we say such a thing, the key of success is patience, and before that, its foundation is to believe with certainty in the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there is one condition. One condition. What is this condition? This condition, dear brother, respected sister, is about your heart. If you have a heart that is alive, and you listen to the Quran and you read the Quran with an attentive ear, that one is going to happen. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَعْدَ اللَّهِ لَا يُخْلِفُ اللَّهُ وَعْدَ. Allah, the promise of Allah, the promise of the truth, never Allah fail His promise. But most of the people, they do not know. So if, subhanAllah, our belief into the promise of Allah is weak, we become from the rest of the people, not believers. وَلَكِنَّ أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. And what subhanAllah distract them? قَالَ يَعْلَمُونَ ظَاهِرًا مِنَ الْحَيَاةِ الدُّنْيَا. They are skilled in knowing all the apparent affairs of this worldly life. All the good shortcut to make money, to do this. And they are totally unaware, heedless of the matter of the akhirah. Therefore, one condition, dear brother, respected sister, to save our hearts, to make it a heart that is awakened, a heart that is attentive, and you will have, subhanAllah, channels of communication, attentive, and with your eyes reflective, you can reflect with them, is to have the akhirah a part of your daily life, the hereafter. You might die tomorrow. You're going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't be among those who have meeting Allah is something that we believe in it, but it's very far. It's like it's not going to happen almost. It's like a fiction. No, it's a reality. And you need to make it a reality, that it manifests truly in your conduct, in the way how you plan your life. The Prophet ﷺ taught you when you wake up to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be grateful to Allah that He gave you your life after you've been dead. Which is helping us for every day to take advantage of that day. Why? Because we have been resurrected again. So if we neglect this part of our life to live the eternity from today, then you're going to have weak iman, faith in the promise of Allah. And if you have weak iman in the promise of Allah, subhanAllah, everything else will collapse. And we will not be from those who rejoicing the victory of Allah because it happened and we didn't know. Why you didn't know? Because you are heedless. And that is a big problem. One of the tabi'een, he's narrating a hadith, from his father. He said, his father saying, قال, I witnessed the defeat of the Romans by the Persian. And I witnessed the defeat of the Persian by the Romans. And I witnessed the defeat of the Romans and the Persian by the Muslims. And all happened within 15 years. Why? Because truthful heart. Like Abu Bakr said, I only did it, Ya Rasulullah, out of faith in Allah and His Messenger. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our faith in Allah and His Messenger, and to strengthen our heart, to have the promise of Allah in our heart, to be certain as you seeing the sun in the midday. اللهم اغفر لنا ذنوبنا أجمعين وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. اللهم مكن إخواننا في الشام، اللهم مكنهم يا رب العالمين، واجمع كلمتهم وألف بين قلوبهم. اللهم أفرغ صبرا على إخواننا في غزة وفلسطين. اللهم ارحمهم برحمتك وانصرهم نصرا عزيزا، إنك على كل شيء قدير وبالإجابة جدير. نعم المولى ونعم النصير. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأقيم الصلاة يرحمكم الله.